Hello, and welcome to topic 4, which is on the free exercise of religion, and this is the first lecture for that topic. This is an overview of what we're going to be covering in topic 4. And because there's a lot of material in this first half of chapter 4 on the free exercise of religion, I'm going to be doing 3 videos this semester or this for this topic, just to kind of make shorter videos and to break up the material a little bit more into more easily consumable chunks. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the religious landscape in the United States and at the founding, and the impact that that had on the creation of the religious clause in the Bill of Rights. And also, we're going to distinguish between the free exercise clause and the establishment clause. In the next lecture, we're going to look at how the Supreme Court defines religion, since action that is motivated by religion gets protection by the Bill of Rights. We have to know what constitutes religion, because action motivated by something other than religion would not be necessarily protected by the First Amendment. And then we're going to look at the so-called belief action distinction. And then in the third lecture, we're going to take a look at the free exercise clause tests. We learned in our last chapter on incorporation that the Supreme Court comes up with tests to help guide their decision making and the decision making in future cases as well. And they have done this for the free exercise clause. And so we'll be looking at the 3 tests that the courts have developed. So let's get started. When you look at the First Amendment, the first liberty to be mentioned in the First Amendment is not freedom of speech or the freedom to assemble or the freedom of the press. But the first liberty that is mentioned has to do with religious freedoms. And that's a reflection of our unique religious history in the United States. As we all know, that the early colonies were settled by the Puritans, who were seeking freedom, seeking religious freedom from the Church of England, where they were persecuted. And so religious freedom motivated people to settle in the so-called New World. Now, as it mentions in your textbook, that while religious liberty was a motivator to leave England and come to the colonies, as your textbook points out, that once here, that it wasn't that religious liberty was extended to all people living in this new land. Once here, the colonists did not readily embrace religious freedom and diversity for those that were not a member of their religious tradition. Certain religions were persecuted. Historically, the Quakers, the Baptists, states established religion. So your textbook talks about how, initially in state constitution, there was nothing forbidding the establishment of a religion, and many states, had an established religion. For example, Virginia established itself under the Church of England, or Anglicanism, what we call the Episcopal Church today. And so that we do see that once here, religious freedom wasn't necessarily embraced, but there was a lot of religious diversity within the early states and within the colonies. That there were many sects of Protestantism. And so when we think about within Christianity, the big division between Catholics and Protestants, but Protestants have, many, many different sects. The Congregationalists, which is an offshoot of the Puritans, the Anglican, which becomes the Episcopal Church. You have, Quakers and Baptists. But you also had Catholics and Jews and Muslims. And so there was a lot of religious diversity even in the early colonies and states. And that diversity obviously continues today. We find that, when looking at that religious diversity, that it was oftentimes the source of conflict, that minority religious groups were often attacked or banished from certain states due to having a different religious perspective. And so that's why there's this move within at the Constitutional Convention and afterwards, with the addition of the Bill of Rights, to make sure that there are protections, religious protections in the Constitution in order to minimize, in an effort to minimize conflict. On the one hand, if you tell in our Constitution, it says that you have the freedom to practice your religion, then that means that no one group could be criminalized for practicing a religion that wasn't the a majority or a more recognized religion within a state or a colony. Obviously, states after the Constitution. Likewise, that you didn't want to give favor to one religion over another, and so that was why the Establishment Clause was added. And we'll look at these clauses in more detail in a second. So these constitutional protections set the stage for protecting people's religion and for minimizing conflict within the early states. The United States continues to be a religious nation. If you're interested in learning more about the landscape of religion within the United States, I encourage you to check out the Pew Foundation. Every several years, they do what's called a religious landscape study. It's a really large study of survey of over 35,000 people. It has a really low margin of error, and it gives us a really good look at the religious landscape in the United States. And the information in this slide is derived from the religious landscape study. Americans are, religious, and we believe in God. And only 9% of Americans say that they don't believe in God at all. 83% of Americans are absolutely or fairly certain in their belief in God. 77% say that religion is a very or somewhat important aspect of their life. 71% of people in the United States pray daily, and over half of us, 71% of us pray weekly, and over half of us pray daily. And so Americans are a religious bunch. It is trending downwards slightly. That it used to be that when you asked people what their religious affiliation was, almost everybody had a religious affiliation. But now nearly a quarter of Americans say that they are not affiliated with a religion. They consider themselves a so-called none of the aboves, not like a nun who wears a habit. But they're not affiliated with a mainstream or identified religion. That doesn't mean that they don't believe in God. Only 3% of Americans consider themselves to be agnostic or atheist, and about the same consider themselves sort of like agnostic. They're not sure about the existence of God. So we are still a very religious nation, even though that we have a larger group of people who are not identifying with an organized religion. We're more religious than other countries like us. And in a second, I'm going to show you a slide that sort of compares religiosity in the United States to other countries and their level of religiosity. But when we look at other advanced democracies that are wealthy, like the United States, they are much less likely to have this high level of religiosity. And a lot of people think that the religious protections that we get in our Constitution sort of foster religion. Religious affiliation is very diverse, as I mentioned in the last slide, because we have a lot of, there's religious pluralism. When we think about religion in the United States, that you are not forced to worship, the state doesn't support one religion over another, and that you have the freedom to worship. And so that kind of leads to this marketplace of religious ideas where different religious groups are sort of competing in the marketplace to say, hey, come over to my religion and join, become one of our adherents. And so that vibrant sort of, competition between religions has actually made us a religiously pluralistic society, but also has maybe contributed to the continued embracing of religion in the United States. Okay, this is the graph that I mentioned on the previous slide, and it comes from the Pew Global Attitudes Project. It was a survey of people throughout the world, throughout the globe, asking them their attitudes about religion. And it was from 2007. It's a little dated, but it's still accurate in terms of reflecting sort of the differences that you see here. Now, to read this slide, note that on the x-axis that runs across the bottom of the page, that's a measure of how wealthy your country is, okay? So the farther you are to the right end, it means that you're more wealthy because you have a higher per capita income. And so you see there that countries like Sweden, Britain, Canada, and the United States being the most wealthy country, right? United States has like about a per capita wealth of about $45,000 per person. The y-axis is telling us about how religious that country is in terms of the religious beliefs of the people in that country. The respondents to the survey were asked 3 questions. And if they answered yes to each of the questions, they got a point. One question was, did they believe that faith in God is necessary for morality? In other words, do you have to believe in God to be a moral actor? The other question they asked was that, is religion a very important component of your life? And the other is, do you pray at least once a day? So if you answered yes to all those questions, yes, you need to believe in God for morality, that religion is very important, and that you pray once a day, you would score a 3, okay? If you answered no to all of those, you'd score a 0, okay? And so take a look at this graph. The countries like Senegal, Nigeria, Indonesia, Pakistan, Jordan, those are all countries that are relatively poor, but have a high religiosity rate, okay? They scored close to a 3, okay, or above a 2.5, okay? Countries like Japan, France, Sweden, Britain, Canada, they have a low level of religiosity, okay, not even scoring 1, but somewhere, above 0.5, but relatively wealthy. So you can ask yourself, looking at this graph, is what's sort of the relationship between wealth and belief in religion? Well, you could see that the poorer a country is, the more likely they are to be religious. And you could think about why that might be. Religion often talks about sort of the world beyond the world that you're living in right now. And so if you're poor and suffering, you might be looking towards, the afterlife for some relief. Could have to do with the lack of education, and that religious explanations for phenomenon within the world might make more sense, or you might be more willing to turn to religion for those explanations because you're not getting the explanations to your education, etc. But there does seem to be a relationship between wealth and religious belief. We're kind of speculating about what that might be. The flip side of that, the more wealthy your country is, the less likely you are to be religious. And you can maybe ask yourself why that is. Maybe if your life on planet Earth is really, really comfortable because you're wealthy, that you might not be looking to the afterlife, right? That you don't feel like you need to look towards religion to get relief from the hideous world that you're living in, because your world's pretty damn good. It could also be a component of education as well. Live in a wealthy nation, you're more likely to get sort of a scientific explanation for the phenomenon in the world that sort of questions the religious explanation for those phenomena. But note how the United States is an outlier there, right? We are really wealthy, but we have a really high level of religiosity, particularly in comparison to other countries like us. And countries that you might be you'd think there'd be a high level of religiosity in Spain or Italy or Poland than in the United States, but not so much. So maybe ask yourself why. Why is the United States an outlier here, right? What is it about the United States? Obviously, we have a religious tradition regarding the colonists coming over here, but it could also have to do with the religious protections that we get in our Constitution. You're not forced to believe anything. You can choose whatever religion you want. That might lead you to be more religious. Our state doesn't support religion. We don't have the intertwining of politics and the church. And that might make the church seem more pristine, right? We may not see sort of like how powerful and power struggling just sort of like the same as our governmental institutions. There's a separation there. So again, it's just sort of speculation, but some interesting things to think about. One country, many religions. So this is the last slide on sort of looking at our background. So I just thought you might think that this is kind of cool, that one visual, representation of how many religions we have in the United States is from the Department of Veterans Affairs. The federal VA, that if you are a service member, that you can choose to get a religious marker on your gravestone. If you've ever been to Arlington Cemetery and walk around, you'll see that there are religious engravements into the gravestones of service members. And there are currently 74 religious emblems that you can choose from, that your family can choose from, or yourself as you are laid to rest if you're a former service member. And this just shows you just sort of like a handful of them. On the top row, you got, going from left to right, United Church of Christ, Presbyterian Cross, the Buddhist Wheel of Righteousness, Judaism, the Catholic Celtic Cross. In the middle row, Native American Church of North America, which we're going to be reading about in the Smith case, Muslim, Unitarian Universalist, Mormon, which the angel Moroni blowing his horn, and even atheists that have an emblem. And on the bottom, we have Wicca, which is a sort of, worshiping of nature. Humanist, in the middle there, the American Methodist Episcopal Church. Sikh with the sword, and I've got the Seventh-day Adventist there, since as you're going to be reading in this chapter, we have Seventh-day Adventists to thank for a lot of our understanding, as with the Mormons, our understanding of religious liberties. I looked for the Amish and also the Jehovah Witnesses to see whether or not they had an emblem for military graves, and they do not. You're going to be reading about the Amish and the Jehovah Witnesses, who also contributed to the Free Exercise Clause jurisprudence. It very well may be because Jehovah Witnesses and Amish they are pacifists, and so there's probably not a need for them since they probably don't have a military grave. Okay, so let's shift gears here and talk about the two clauses that you're going to be learning about in Chapter 4. The first half of Chapter 4 is dedicated to the Free Exercise Clause, and the other half is dedicated to the Establishment Clause. And so you see the First Amendment up there, that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And those are the two clauses that you're going to be learning about in this chapter. One is called the Establishment Clause. And the Establishment Clause is basically saying that you cannot enact laws which aid one or all religions or give preference to one religion over another. Seems pretty straightforward, but we're going to see that with the cases that we're going to be reading and a little exercise we're going to be doing next, what constitutes an establishment of religion isn't always clear. Sure, if the state of Wisconsin passed a law that said the state religion of Wisconsin is Catholicism, clearly they've violated the Establishment Clause. But what if public schools start each day with a prayer? Is that a violation of the Establishment Clause? And we turn to the Supreme Court to tell us the answer to that. The Establishment Clause is oftentimes talked about the wall separating church and state. The other clause, which is not in the Constitution, and in the Constitution it doesn't say that there's a wall separating of church and state. That comes from Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists, okay, just to be clear. But we oftentimes think about the Establishment Clause that way. The Free Exercise Clause is what we're going to be reading about this week, and it protects the right of people to believe and practice whatever religion one chooses. What we're going to find is you can believe whatever you want, right? If you want to believe that sacrificing 7 virgins on an altar made of ivory with a platinum knife at the full moon, whatever your beliefs are, you can believe that, right? But if you put those beliefs into practice, you're probably going to, the state's going to be within their right to crack down on that practice and tell you that it's a criminal practice. But sacrificing virgins on an altar is usually not a practice that we see a lot. But let's say you want to deny your child medical treatment or deny your child education because of your religious beliefs. Can you do that? And we'll find out the answers to some of those questions in this chapter. It's the court who tells us whether or not your practice is protected by the First Amendment. Okay, so if we were in class together, we would be breaking up into pairs, and I would be asking you, I on the one side, we're going to have these issues here, and I'm going to be asking you what is at issue. We're not in class together, so what I want you to do is I want you to ask yourself, is this an establishment clause case? In other words, is the state attempting to establish a religion or give benefit or support to a religion or religious doctrine? Or is what is issue is the state attempting to limit or regulate an individual's practice of religion? And that would be a free exercise clause case. So let me put these cases up here, these issues up here, and then I want you to turn off the lecture and write down, hey, do you think this is free exercise or establishment clause? And then we'll come back and we'll look at the answers. Issue 1, state law mandates that creationism be taught in public high school biology classes, okay? And keep in mind, creationism is the religious explanation for the origin of humans. Number 2, tax dollars are given as vouchers to parents, and then they can use those vouchers to pay for the tuition when they send their child to a religious school. Establishment clause or free exercise clause. 3, state law prohibits the handling of venomous snakes by non-animal experts. And I'll give you a hint, and they mention this in the textbook. Some religions believe that if you have enough Holy Spirit in you and you handle a venomous snake and it bites you, you won't die because you're holy enough and you'll be protected. But if you don't have enough Holy Spirit in you and you're bit by a venomous snake, you're going to die. So, free exercise or establishment. Churches are exempt from paying local property taxes. So everybody else has to pay property taxes if they own property, but not churches. Free exercise or establishment clause. And then finally, correctional facilities, which are owned by the state, must provide sweat lodges for Native American prisoners. All right, turn the video off and then come back and let me know what you had. Well, you can look and see whether your answers are correct. All right, so here are the answers. State law mandates that creationism be taught in high school biology class. Who had establishment clause? Ding, ding, ding. That's an establishment clause case because the state is basically giving support to a religious doctrine, the religious doctrine of creationism. Number 2, state money is given as vouchers to parents, and they can use those to send to their child to religious school. What kind of case is that? If you had establishment clause, ding, 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 you get that correct. And we're going to be reading both of these cases in topic 5, in the second half of chapter 4. Actually, if you said it's neither an establishment clause case or a free exercise clause case, that actually might come closer to the right answer in number 2 than saying it's an establishment clause case. And you'll find out why when we read that case next week. State law prohibits the handling of venomous snakes by non-animal experts. Which is it? Ding! Free exercise. If you got free exercise, that you're correct. Because you're trying to exercise your religion. I want to handle snakes to prove that I've got the Holy Spirit in me. So it's the state trying to say you can't exercise your religion in that way. Churches are exempt from paying local property taxes. Free exercise clause or establishment clause? It's an establishment clause case. And we're going to be learning about that in the second half of chapter 4. It's kind of complicated, so I'll just leave it there. When you're reading it, you'll go, oh, yeah, I get why it's an establishment clause case. And then finally, if you answered free exercise clause to the correctional facility must provide sweat lodges for Native Americans prisoners, ding, 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 you are correct because sweat lodge is a part of the religious tradition for many Native Americans. All right, that's it for this lecture. In the next lecture, we're going to be talking about how the court defines religion and the belief-action distinction. I hope you enjoyed this sort of background information. I mean, I don't know, many of you have maybe never even taken an American government class, so I didn't want to assume that you knew the difference between the establishment clause and the free exercise clause. And so now we all know. All right, great, and I will talk to you again soon.